For more than a month now, Israel has waged an unprecedented war on the besieged Gaza Strip, what many have described quite frankly as genocidal ethnic cleansing, an attempt to wipe out and or expel Palestinians from their homes. But we all know that all this didn't start on October 7th, nor is it likely to end if and when the Israeli military stops bombing the besieged enclave. This has gone on for 75 years. Will it ever end? Let's take a sidebar and talk to Daniel Pipes, a controversial academic and political commentator and the president of the US-based Middle East Forum. Mr. Daniel Pipes, thank you very much for joining us on Sidebar. You've recently written a book entitled Israel Victory, Zionist Acceptance and Palestinian Liberation. Now, we're coming into close to 40 days of what is essentially Israeli attempts at genocide in Gaza. This isn't, as everybody knows, the first time that there has been a war on Gaza, nor did the crisis that exists in that area start 40 days ago. It's something that has been going on for decades now. So I want to start by asking where you view things moving forward and how you view that this decades-long conflict can come to some sort of an end.
Sure, I'd be happy to. But before we get started, could I ask you not to use such loaded terms as Israeli genocide against the Palestinians? That then requires me to have to answer it. So I'm not going to answer it.
I mean, if you don't need to, I'm just for our viewers. The United Nations Article 2 of the UN Convention describes genocide as a crime committed with the intent to destroy a nation, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part. The Oxford English Dictionary describes it as the deliberate killing of a people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying. So, they're not my words.
We won't have a productive conversation if you're going to quote me the United Nations. I can point out to you what happened October 7th. That's not productive. I don't really want to engage.
What about the Oxford English Dictionary?
I do not want to engage in polemics about the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's really not a useful thing. So please don't use words like genocide, and I won't.
You're free. Of course, you're free to disagree with them. But let's move on. I mean, those are, like I say, they're not opinions. We're just going with what we view in the English language as the most accurate term as journalists, and that's all. But go ahead. How do you view things moving forward?
Moving forward, I see that the Israelis seem to be today, November 14th, on the verge of taking control of Gaza, or at least northern Gaza, and that Hamas seems to have lost control of it. And so this is a very important moment because now we will see what the Israelis have in mind for the future of Gaza. There are various options. One is for the Israelis to come back and take it over and administer the area. A second is to bring in the Palestinian Authority. A third is to invite some combination of foreign countries and organizations to come in and take it over. I have my own idea, which is that the Israelis carefully and quickly turn the administration over to Gazans who are opposed to Hamas, opposed to the goal of destroying Israel, Gazans who are willing to live in a neighborly way next to Israel. That's not to say they're pro-Israel. I'm not saying they're democratic. I'm not saying it's a great place to be, but it's a decent place to be. Gaza has suffered for the last 15 years from the rule of Hamas. I think the Gazans would be much better off if they lived in environments such as those that can be found in Egypt or Jordan. I'm hoping that the Israelis will and the Gazans will agree to such an arrangement where Gaza is administered, police, schools, hospitals, utilities, by Gazans themselves. No
Mr.
longer
Pipes, if you don't mind, I want to ask you just a couple of things just to kind of deconstruct a little bit of that view there. The first is your suggestion that the Israelis should hand over the administration to Gazans that or people in Gaza that it deems fit, right? Not that the people in Gaza should choose who their leadership is.
Precisely, because in no Arab-speaking country do the people decide who their leadership is. So this would be completely consistent with Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and beyond.
Is that because Arabs don't deserve to choose who their leadership should be?
No, it's because it has been very difficult for democratic institutions to last. Look at Lebanon, where they lasted longest. It's very difficult. So let's not look for the ideal. Let's accept the realistic.
But don't you view that as a problematic approach, that Western or foreign or essentially foreign people should decide on behalf of an indigenous people who should rule them?
It's not ideal, but it's certainly better than what has been the case in Gaza.
It's pretty racist,
for the last 15 years. Not racist at all. It's saying Gaza is in terrible condition, and to establish administration of Gaza.
Why is it in a terrible condition?
It's in a terrible condition because rather than build a constructive, economically buoyant, politically stable country, Hamas has used Gaza as a platform to attack Israel.
What's the foundations of a strong, economically stable country or entity?
Well, the first thing you do is not try and destroy your much larger, more powerful neighbor.
Okay, but it's based on trade, no?
Trade, indeed.
How can you trade when you are besieged by land, air, and sea?
I point out that Gaza has two borders, one with Israel and one with Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And if the Gazan authorities, Hamas, had not been so destructive in their intentions, the borders would have been open on both sides and Gazans would come and go, trade would come and go. But because this was, for 15 years, 2008 until the present, used as a platform for attack,
mm-hmm.
Of course it was isolated and besieged, but that was a choice that Hamas made. But I really don't want to argue the rights and wrongs of the Arab-Israeli,
but I think
Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
No, but it's based on the not to argue about rights or wrongs. No, it's just about trying to understand your view moving forward, because it's based on a premise. And what I'm understanding, and I read some of the excerpts of your book and other writings, and now discussing with you, the premise that you're going off on, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that number one, the Palestinians shouldn't have a right to self-determination. They should be dictated who will rule them. Number two, that they are somehow responsible for the misery that they live in, and essentially it negates the fact that they have been under illegal occupation as well as besiegement for decades, essentially. And therefore that premise seems as a false one. How can you base a solution when the actual prognosis that has been applied to it is an inaccurate one?
You're making 2 points. The first one is about the Israelis finding the administrators. I agree with you, that's not ideal, but it's a lot better than Hamas ruling the territory.
Why don't we say that the Israelis, somebody should come and dictate to the Israelis who rules them, instead of members of the Knesset or the cabinet who have essentially called for massacres and ethnic cleansing?
I thought I'm coming on to discuss, my idea is not to discuss the rights and wrongs.
This isn't about discussing rights and wrongs. I'm arguing about your idea.
Do I really need to point out to you that the Israelis left Gaza in 2005? Do you really need to?
I would, yes, of course, because they didn't leave, sir. And you know this. Come on, let's not. I'm not coming. You've now brought that up, not me. But they didn't leave in 2005. They besieged it. They locked the doors. They decided who goes in, what goes in. You can't go fishing a few kilometers into the water. You can't fly a kite without being there. Boys who were shot on the beach. You can't bring that.
I really don't want to do this. I really don't want to argue the rights and wrongs of the Gaza-Israel.
This isn't about arguing rights or wrong. It's about trying to understand your point of view moving forward, sir. You can't accept. You can't expect me to accept it, or you can't expect the viewer to accept it without understanding what it is based on. It's a very simple discussion. That's all.
It is based on the fact that Israel left completely. Every single Israeli left, was forced out in 2005 by its own military. The Israelis left, and they wanted nothing to do with Gaza. But the Gazans kept attacking them. And so they had to find ways to deal with it. But the fact is that until a few weeks ago, Gaza had no Israelis in it whatsoever.
Sir, if I was to leave your house and park a tank outside it and park a tank on the back, would you consider yourself free?
This is so tedious, really. You really want to argue this?
It's
I have
it's
ideas. You asked me
okay.
about my ideas.
So
I'm
tell me,
happy to give
tell
you
me your
ideas.
ideas.
I
So
am.
tell me.
I really.
Go ahead. Let's hear your ideas moving forward. Aside from the Palestinians being dictated, who should lead them? What else are they, sir?
I believe that let's call them Israelis and Palestinians, though they weren't called that in the 19th century. I believe that the Israelis and Palestinians have two sets of mentalities.
Mm-hmm.
They go back the whole way 140 years to the 1880s that are very consistent and are very inappropriate. And I'm hoping there'll be changes in them. Those ideas are, on the Palestinian side, that Zionism, Jews, Israel are unwanted, should not be there, should be pushed out, should be killed, should be rejected.
All three of them: Zionism, Jews, and Israel. You're
Yes.
conflating both Judaism and Zionism here. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
With the exception of a few members of what are called the old Yishuv, the pre-Zionist Jews of Palestine in the 1820s, 30s. But those few exceptions, people who prayed and didn't do much economically or socially, that they rejected this. They didn't want it. And that has been the approach of the Palestinians ever since. And the Zionist or Israeli approach has been to try and placate and try and conciliate and try and enrich and say to the Palestinians, look, you'll be better off. You'll have modern agriculture, you'll have roads, you'll have fresh water, you'll have electricity. You'll be better off thanks to our presence here. And this was an approach that started way, way back 140 years ago and continues today. These may have made sense in the 1880s. They don't make sense today. And I'm hoping that there can be a change in these attitudes of rejection and conciliation, which are very sterile, which go on decade after decade, and which lead us to the problems which we now have.
So we'll go into, if you don't mind, those two attitudes, as you mentioned. The first one, if you don't mind, I'll start with the latter one, which is, as you say, the attempts by Zionists to placate the Palestinians, as you mentioned, and to convince them that they would be better off with Zionist presence because of agriculture, water, and economy, right?
Placate and enrich. Yes, you're talking about enrichment. Okay. Yeah, yep.
So
that's correct.
So over the past 75 years, Arab-owned land has reduced drastically. The demolition of Arab homes has increased greatly. Unemployment has increased. You've got, aside from, I'm not going to get into all the schools that have been bombed and all the killings and all of that, but let's just go into the economic perspective of things, as you mentioned there, with water resources, according to the United Nations and other international organizations, in fact, according to B'Tselem, being hugely skewed in favor of the Jewish population of Israel. It's a very strange way of trying to show that you're trying to placate the population. I mean, I'd hate to see how trying to show them that you dislike them would look like.
Okay, well, let's take that. The Israelis took control of Gaza and the West Bank.
Not just Gaza, I'm talking about the entirety.
I said Gaza and the West Bank in June 1967. The next 20 years until the beginning of the Intifada showed an extraordinary economic success in both areas. They were one of the fastest growing economic areas in the world, faster than, for example, Taiwan and South Korea, faster than Israel itself. For the residents of the West Bank and Gaza, for the Palestinians, it was enormously successful.
Based
Universities,
on what metrics?
I'll be happy to send you the proof. The universities got started. There were no universities before. Hospitals got established. Electricity grids
by who? That's what I'm asking you. Who? What are these?
We're not talking about who. I'm saying that for 20 years, there was an economic boom in the West Bank and Gaza. So long as the Israelis were in charge and there wasn't much of a protest against them, it was a tremendous economic boom that began to end with the Intifada, and it completely ended after the Oslo Accords, Yasser Arafat coming in, taking over, making clear that economics was not his concern, that he was interested in using the West Bank and Gaza as platforms for the destruction of Israel. And Hamas furthered that. So now you have the economic horror story that you can see in Gaza. But it was doing very well. So you shouldn't conflate all these different periods. The Palestinian people are perfectly capable of building their economy and living good, productive lives, but they have in the form
so long
of
as they're
Yasser
subservient
Arafat,
to the Israelis, is what you're saying.
no, so long as they're not under Yasser Arafat and Hamas, so long as they're not under brutal totalitarian thugs who use them, exploit them as cannon fodder against the Israelis.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, obviously, in the absence of figures that corroborates your view here, let's move to the idea of the Palestinians, as you mentioned, rejecting Zionism, and as well, you said they're Jews as well. Although you did say there was an exception of the Jews. I'm assuming here you're talking about the Samaritan Jews, or I'm not sure, or the which Jews you're talking about that the Arabs didn't reject.
The old Yeshua, that is to say, the very small group of pious Jews who came mostly from Eastern Europe to Jerusalem, Tiberias, Safat,
yes,
Hebron, to pray, basically, to be close
who'd
to
been
the
there
Holy
for many years.
No, many of them came newly.
Recently.
They were immigrants, a number of them, but they were not in any way a challenge. They were not engaged in agriculture. They were not building economic base. They did not have an ideology about building a Jewish homeland. So they were in theory acceptable.
So see that point there that you put in there, that they weren't interested in building a Jewish homeland. Here's why I want to ask you about why you coupled both Zionism and Judaism, because historically, and obviously you are a historian and somebody who is well read on it, historically, Jews living in the Arab world prior to Zionism did not have an issue as they did, for example, in Europe or in Russia and other places. And to assume that the Palestinians, as you mentioned there, have some sort of innate objection to Judaism and want to push some sort of agenda against Jews either within Palestine or even, as you mentioned, internationally, is something that doesn't really add up with the fact that it is about Judaism in so much as it is about those who came to set up a land on their land.
Well, you put words in my mouth. Let me say what I think rather than
Please do
respond to your version of what I think. I think, yes, I agree that the experience of Jews in Muslim countries, let's drop the word Arab, Muslim countries, whether Arabic speaking or Turkish speaking or Persian speaking or otherwise, the experience of Jews in Muslim countries until 1945 was better than the experience of Jews in Christian countries, no question. That's not to say it was ideal. It was not to say that there wasn't bias, there wasn't prejudice, there wasn't discrimination. There was plenty of that. But overall, the Jewish experience was better in Muslim majority countries than in Christian majority countries. And the proof of that is that time and again, Jews from the 7th century till the 20th went from Christian majority countries to Muslim majority countries. The very first time, I think, was in Egypt in the 630s AD, and the last time was during the build-up to World War II, when German Jews left Germany and went to Turkey. One sees this again and again. True, it's not. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than the.
There was no pogroms, there was no Holocaust, there wasn't mass killings, there wasn't any of that.
There was certainly no Holocaust. There were small pogroms, but yes, overall, it's definitely better. Since 1945, however, and that predates Israel, since 1945, the situation isn't dramatically reversed, where the circumstances of Jews much better, Christian majority countries than Muslim majority countries. So look, 1 million Jews left Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, go a whole way across to Afghanistan. All of them, essentially all of them left. There may be 20,000 now. They left. It became very, very unpleasant. And that's because the latent anti-Semitism that exists in Islam became not latent anymore, but blatant, became forward.
Why? Was that just
This is-
coincidental, or why do you think that was?
that had to do with the leadership of the Muslim majority countries that decided that anti-Jewish sentiments, as well as anti-Zionist sentiments, were useful to them. So, for example, in a place like Morocco, which historically was quite a good place for Jews, there were many efforts to show the Jews that they were not welcome. And so they left. They left.
You don't think that the fact that there was, for the past 15 years before that, mass migration towards Palestine, there was the setting up of militia like the Irgun and the Haganah and others, and there was massacres that were taking place on Arab lands, that word spread around the Arab world, and that fed into the sentiment that was being targeted towards them?
So you're justifying the treatment of, say, Iraqi Jews by what happened in Palestine?
I'm not justifying. I'm asking you, do you think there's a corroboration? I'm not trying to justify anything. I'm just asking, do you believe there could have been a corroboration between the two? That's all.
There's no question that the Palestinian movement, led by Amin al-Husseini, encouraged leaders from countries like Iraq, Egypt, and Morocco to turn against their Jews, to apply pressure on their Jews. And they did. They found it useful. Now, the Arab-speaking countries, the governments of Arabic-speaking countries, long ago realized, excuse me, that this was not a good idea. They pursued this 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and then they stopped. This is no longer what the governments are doing. It's quite dramatic. I mean, you'll see very nasty language coming out of Iran and Turkey, but you don't hear it coming out of Arab capitals. Arab capitals don't do this anymore. They've left this behind. They realized that this was not useful.
But by Arab capitals, do you mean the regimes or the people?
No, I'm talking about the regimes. The regimes, let's take Nasser, the best known, the most important. He was a soldier in 1948 fighting against Israel. He came to power in the early 50s, and he found the antagonism against anti-Zionism. He found it to be very, very helpful in mobilizing and distracting his population. And his population was mobilized and distracted. He's long gone. He died in 1970, and his successors have all, for this 50 plus years, been trying to move away from that. They find anti-Zionism a problem. However, the Egyptian population remains quite anti-Zionist. And the governments are trying to reduce this.
So I want to ask you on that point. That's why I wanted to see where your view was on that. Because here we're going to come to the normalization and other things about moving forward within, not just within Palestine, but beyond in the region. But first, I just want to ask you, you had said, speaking at the Zionist Federation once or Congress, that the Israelis must be encouraged to defeat the Palestinians. I just want to understand, what does that mean? What do you mean by the Israelis? Because part of your book is calling for, you say that diplomacy doesn't work, essentially, and the way forward is for total victory in war by the Israelis, and only then can the Palestinians be liberated, ultimately, when they're totally defeated. Can you explain that a bit, please?
You're not quoting me accurately. I didn't say total victory in war. I said victory, that's all. And by what I mean by victory is that the Palestinians recognize that their mentality of protectionism, of saying no, 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 is bad for them, bad for Israel, bad for everyone. That it's time for the Palestinians to come to terms with the existence of the state of Israel. It is 75 years old. It is there, it is strong, it is permanent, and it's time for the Palestinians to come to terms with it. And when they do, they will be liberated from their obsessive irredentism against their neighbor, which harms their neighbor, of course, Israel, but it harms them even more. I mean, look at Gaza today. Look how much harm this has done. But it's time for the Palestinians to move on. And that's only going to happen when the Israelis make that their goal, which they're not doing until now. Maybe in the last few weeks it's changed. But until now, their approach has been one of management, dealing with it. But I think that's the wrong approach. It just keeps it
I
going.
need to just deconstruct this because, again, this is something for our viewers to understand here. And these aren't loaded terminologies. Like I say, I will reference B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, and Amnesty International and others, who say that what Israel is practicing is apartheid. Okay? Now, ultimately, how it comes across, and please feel free to correct me and if I'm misquoting or misunderstanding you, but how it comes across here is it as if somebody were to tell the Black South Africans, the indigenous people of South Africa, or Nelson Mandela, that you must stop resisting apartheid because it will just bring you misery. And the sooner you liberate yourself from an attempt to free yourself and just accept that you will be second-class citizens, or accept that you will be governed by, you will have no self-determination, the happier you will be. Is that analogy, in your view, correct?
The analogy, if you must draw an analogy between South Africa and Israel, it would be between the Black South Africans and the Muslim citizens of Israel, who constitute nearly 20% of Israel, who I will not argue
They're also
to
Palestinian
you
Christians, by the way.
Very few, almost entirely Muslim. They're Druze, they're Christians, but it's very, very largely Muslim. They are not in perfect conditions. They have many complaints about police presence, about investment in infrastructure and the like. But they are free people. They are productive people. They are presidents of banks. They're members of the Supreme Court. They're members of Parliament. They're teachers, they're doctors, and so forth. There's no apartheid. They can go where they want. They can live where they want. They have the same rights and duties as Jewish Israelis. It's not perfect, I grant you that, but it is fundamentally egalitarian with every Israeli citizen, whether Muslim or Jewish, or Christian or Druze, or other, having the same rights. So it's an absurd comparison. There's no apartheid regime in Israel. There is equality. How do you explain Muslim Israelis on the Supreme Court? How do you explain that they're ambassadors? How do you explain that they're ministers of state? How do you explain that if there's apartheid?
There's much. I mean, you had the British Home Secretary or the former British Home Secretary who was from an ethnic minority who was the biggest champion of racist policies. It doesn't mean much in the end of the day, and you'll have that in every country where you have tokenistic people. I don't think that, but what will explain the apartheid, as I say, according to human rights organizations, is the different number plates that are being used, is the fact that you have different allocation of water, of electricity, of land, of roads that are specifically designated to settlers to use and others. There's plenty
You're
of
talking about
evidence.
Wait a minute. You're talking about the West Bank. Whether you're right or wrong, you're talking about the West Bank. I'm talking about Israel proper.
What is Israel proper? Because Israel hasn't even defined its borders. What is Israel proper?
Israel proper is within the green line. Within the green line, the citizens of Israel, whether they be Muslim or Jewish, have the same license plates, use the same roads.
What about the ones in Jerusalem? What about the ones in Jerusalem who have house demolitions constantly there?
You brought up South Africa, and I reluctantly went ahead with the comparison. And the comparison is the citizens of South Africa, Black, brown, and white, and the citizens of Israel, Muslim and Jewish. And I'm saying there's no comparison. Now, if you want to switch subjects and go to the West Bank, that's a completely different story. And Gaza, it's a completely different story. But if you want to bring up South Africa, the comparison is with the Israeli Muslim citizens. And they're not tokens. They are everywhere in Israel. They're in hospitals, they're in banks, they're in universities, they're everywhere. They're 20%. Man,
they also get regularly, they're unable to pray in their holy sites. They also have their homes taken from them in Jerusalem. They also have eviction notices constantly. You can't dismiss that and say just because there are a few people that are in some positions that these things don't happen. These are daily practices in Sheikh Jarrah and other places. It's all there.
You're talking about Eastern Jerusalem. That's not what I was talking about. I was talking about the citizens of Israel. The Muslim Jerusalemites are not citizens, or very, very few of them are. It's not the topic. The topic are the citizens, Muslim citizens of that is what's comparable to South Africa. In any case, I just want to finish with one last question, if you don't mind.
I just want
Okay.
to finish with one last question, if you don't mind. And obviously, you've
Okay.
written a lot, not just about Israel-Palestine, but also about what you describe as Islamist extremism. You had obviously the Campus Watch initiative a couple of decades ago, where it was encouraged to essentially report on what you perceive to be threats towards the United States and other places. You described.
Wait. Oh, your character. It's not a couple of decades ago. It's still there today.
But it
Students,
started a couple of decades ago, is my point.
it started, yes, it did,
Yes,
but
that's
it's
what I said.
made it sound like it's over. And it's not primarily about students telling on their teachers. It's a very, very small.
Well, I didn't say students telling on teachers. I said where the point was.
Well, we did want to hear from
at
students. Yes, but that's not the primary purpose. The purpose is to critique the study of the Middle East in the United States.
But there was a part of it, as mentioned. Where I want to ask you about is there's a video that came up online a couple of days ago of a chaplain from the United Kingdom, Leeds University, one of the biggest universities in the United Kingdom, who is currently serving in the Israeli army in Gaza. And he's encouraging his students essentially to support this, even though he is a chaplain at the university. Part of Campus Watch and part of some of your teachings was talking about the threat of what you described as Islamists on campus, and what impact that would have on the fabric of American society, on peace and so forth there, and the threat that it posed to Americans. I haven't read anything or heard anything from you about the dual national Israelis in the West who serve in the Israeli army, and where their loyalty stands, and what impact that extremism can have on the respective societies back, whether in the United States or the United Kingdom or other places.
You brought up so many things about Leeds University, about Campus Watch, about dual citizen Americans. I don't know where to start. Let me just say that there are plenty of dual citizens. I am one myself. I'm both American and Polish. I don't think that's a problem. The Poles don't think it's a problem. The Americans don't think it's a problem. It's very common by now. A lot of people have two or even more.
No, my question is about the dual nationality. It's about serving in the Israeli army, and why that doesn't pose as real a threat as the threats that you say other Muslims pose.
I don't see Muslims as a threat. I don't see Islam as a threat. I see Islamism as a threat. I see Islamism as a radical utopian ideology like fascism and communism that seeks to use people in the pursuit of an ideological goal. It's the Islamists that I'm battling, whether it be on the campus or in any other venue. I think Islamism is a destructive ideology, first of all, to the Muslim population. They're the ones who suffer the most. I mean, look at Afghanistan, look at Iran, look at Sudan, look at Turkey, look at what terrible things it's doing. And secondly, to the outside world. So I'm not fighting Islam. I'm not fighting Muslims. Indeed, Muslims are the main ally in fighting Islamism. Muslims are increasingly turning against Islamism. I believe.
But there's no threat from Zionism, is my question. You don't view a threat from militant Zionism.
You're kidding me. Zionism is a threat. To whom? Come on.
Islamism is just about 6 million Palestinians, or is a threat to the U.S. economy, which it drains for billions of dollars a year, or is a threat to anybody who criticizes Israel and could lose their job in Europe, as we've seen?
We can agree on one thing, that the money the United States taxpayers sends to Israel is a bad idea. A few billion a year. I agree with you. It shouldn't be. But otherwise, I see Zionism as Jewish nationalism no more a threat than French nationalism or Peruvian nationalism or Egyptian nationalism or Qatari nationalism. I see the threat being a transnational, radical, utopian ideology like fascism, communism, or Islamism.
Zionism is transnational, though. But anyway, thank you very much. We've finished our time here. Pleasure talking to you, Mr. Daniel Pipes. Thank you.
You too, Mr. Salami.